So without further ado, an evening with Mr. Wade Hampton Dorsey.
Thank y'all very much for having me. It's very, very nice here at your museum, and the school is beautiful too. It's just really, really nice to see this. We'll get some water right quick. Now, I want to say first of all that I am not an expert in this subject of Francis Salvador. I have learned a lot about Francis Salvador in the last couple of weeks. I think y'all had scheduled, or someone was supposed to come and talk about him, and that didn't work out. So Mr. Widener asked me if I could come, and I said I thought I could, but I was going to have to bone up a bit on this subject. I work in the archives. I deal with a lot of this sort of thing, but I knew who Francis Salvador was. I knew a little bit about him, but as far as details, I never really delved into that. So these last several weeks, I've been learning a lot as well, and I hope that I've learned enough to keep you entertained tonight. Yeah. She said, I work at the Department of Archives and History in Columbia. I've been there for 23 years. I work in the reference room, and so I answer questions that people call in or write in or come in to look at documents or to try to figure something out. We're open Tuesdays through Saturdays from 8:30 to 5, and the public's welcome to come in any time. There's no charge to come in to do research. There are some charges for making photocopies, but we can tell you about that when you come. On the back table, I've put a sheet that has our address and contact numbers and hours if anybody would like to pick one of those up. Yeah, I've entitled this tonight, Francis Salvador, South Carolina's Jewish Revolutionary. Because Mr. Salvador was a fairly unique person in his time and place in South Carolina. And before I can really talk about him, I want to set the stage for South Carolina's part in the Revolution, which was also a very unique place. South Carolina is very different from the other colonial governments. It's somewhat unique among the United States due to geographical, social, economic, and demographic factors. It was founded, as you know, as a business venture by a grant from King Charles II to the 8 Lords Proprietors of Carolina, which was more or less a reward to them for their having assisted him in regaining the English throne after the Revolution. Now, from the very beginning, South Carolina was different. It combined an idealistic legal system, the fundamental constitutions of Carolina, with a very heterogeneous population. Now, the proprietors desired that the colony develop very fast because they were wanting to make money. It was not an altruistic thing like Georgia was. I mean, Georgia was designed as a kind of a charity, but South Carolina was a money-making venture. And so to help develop the colony, the fundamental constitutions provided for a degree of religious freedom that was almost unheard of in that day and time. Any 7 men could join together and profess a combined or a common creed and declare themselves a body politic or a church or a profession and be recognized under the colonial government. It was drawn up by John Locke, who, of course, is the famous political philosopher, the political scientist you were talking about a while ago. But he was also the Earl of Shaftesbury's private secretary. And so he was very involved in the formation of Carolina, and that idea of religious freedom was something that he put to pen. Now, it did exclude Roman Catholics, and of course at that point, for various historical and political reasons, that was a big part of most of English law. The first arrivals here, of course, were mostly of English stock. A lot of them came by way of English colonies and islands in the Caribbean and Bermuda. In particular, South Carolina was an outgrowth of Barbados, the sugar colony. There was a very small amount of land and a lot of growth. And so they were looking for places to expand and move. And South Carolina became one of those places, probably the place. And they brought their way of ordering society with them when they came to Carolina. Those Episcopal parishes, the pastel colors, the building patterns in the Low Country, and slavery all was a part of that Barbadian influence. Promise, I'm going to get to Salvador one of these days. Another group that came early on were the Huguenots, the French Protestants, who had been, they were more or less Calvinist in their worldview. They had been expelled from France in 1685. And they gathered in European countries until they could find a more permanent home. And thousands came to South Carolina after that period. So you have English, you have French Protestants, and then early Carolina began to absorb some groups of European Jewish settlers. And many of these folks had been driven out of their earlier homes, and they went to England and the Netherlands. And they were tolerated there, but not given full political rights. And so they were there, but they were not really entirely settled, but generally welcomed. And South Carolina, with its unique freedom of religion, began to draw individual Jewish people and families fairly early in the settlement of Carolina. And the first confirmed mention of a Jewish person in South Carolina is in 1695, although there may have been some before then. And in that year, some of the Yamasee Indians who lived down in the lower part of the state near Beaufort and in Georgia went on an expedition into Spanish Florida and captured some Spanish Indians down near St. Augustine and brought them back to Carolina. Governor Archdale wanted to find out a little bit about these Indians, and since they spoke Spanish, apparently he employed a Jewish person who also spoke Spanish and who was living in Charlestown to talk to them, and discovered that they were Roman Catholics. And since they were Christians, even though they were Catholics, he did not allow them to be sold into slavery and sent them back to St. Augustine to the governor down there. And that's the first mention for sure that a Jewish person was in South Carolina interpreting amongst Indians. Getting dried out in a hurry. Now that interpreter is not named. He doesn't mention his name. But obviously he spoke Spanish, and that makes a lot of sense because he almost assuredly then was a Sephardic Jew, which is one of those folks in the family who had been driven out of the Iberian Peninsula, out of Portugal or Spain. And these folks often had names that we would think of as Latino names now. And the Ashkenazi Jews, the folks from Eastern Europe and Germany, came later on. But in the earlier periods in Western Europe, it's almost entirely Sephardic at that time. In 1697, 4 Jewish men in South Carolina petitioned for citizenship in the colony, for British and South Carolina citizenship, along with a bunch of the French Protestants, the Huguenots. So they joined together, signed the same petition, and were granted citizenship in Carolina in 1697. And 3 of their names survive: Simon Valentine, Jacob Mendez, and Abraham Avila, all fairly Hispanic sounding and obviously Sephardic names. Now, some of these guys had come from Brazil. They had been expelled from Portuguese Brazil and had come to South Carolina seeking a haven. And some came from Amsterdam, which was kind of the center of the Sephardic Jewish settlement in Europe at that time. Now, as some of them moved into England, a lot of them were merchants and shipping traders and things of that nature, and they began to accumulate a fair amount of wealth. And so they began to think in terms of trying to settle some of the poorer Jewish folks in America to give them a leg up and get them out of London, where things were not so pleasant for poor people. And so early on in the Georgia colony, they sent a fair number of poor European Jews to Savannah to settle them. But this was almost at the same time that war erupted between England and Spain. The Spanish are down in St. Augustine, and so the war doesn't go all that well at times. And so a lot of the Jewish folks were very worried that the Spaniards would attack and capture Savannah. And so most of them bugged out and went to Charleston and intended to stay in Charleston instead. Yeah. These settlement plans continued. In 1737, two guys in England, two wealthy Sephardic Jews, one named Isaac da Costa and the other named Francis Salvador, not our Francis Salvador, his grandfather. We'll get to him shortly. All right. They began to work with a man named John Hamilton to acquire and settle thousands of acres of land in the backcountry of South Carolina. Now, the Hamilton wanted to make a lot of money in speculating in land, and the Sephardic Jewish guys were interested in settling other Jewish people on that land. So they were kind of working together, but they had different end goals, I guess you would say. But after about 10 years of work, this project never came to fruition. Hamilton was never able to get that grant that he had hoped to get in the backcountry. But the Da Costa and the Salvador families in London, they continued to be interested in South Carolina. And eventually, they bought several huge tracts of land in what is now Greenwood and Abbeville counties. And it was this land purchase in 1755 that eventually brought our Francis Salvador to South Carolina some years later. I don't know how familiar y'all may be with John Hamilton, but he had a huge survey done of several hundred thousands of acres in that area. It's called Hamilton's Great Survey, and he was interested in getting that grant. He never did, but that land did continue on, and we'll talk about it more in a minute. Now, Francis Salvador, the American Patriot, the subject of our talk tonight, was born in London in 1747, and he was the son of Jacob Salvador, and he was the great-grandson of Joseph Salvador, who was a Portuguese Jew who had immigrated to Amsterdam and had been fortunate enough and wealthy enough, he acquired a coat of arms, and so he had become not noble, but a gentry sort of person. His son, Francis Salvador of Amsterdam and London, became a wealthy merchant in London and was granted an English coat of arms by the English College of Heralds. A drawing of that coat of arms is in the Beth Elohim Synagogue in Charleston. They've owned it for many, many, many years, and I think it's stored at the College of Charleston now for safekeeping. But it's almost completely faded out, but it still exists. Now, the elder Francis was involved in the project to settle poor Jews in South Carolina. But when the project came to naught, he and his family kept their eyes open for opportunities in the Carolina backcountry. And so the elder Francis had two sons, Jacob and Joseph, and Jacob had two sons, Moses and Francis. And that Francis is the Revolutionary War Francis that we're going to continue to talk about. working at the archives, genealogy is important. That's what most everybody comes to do. That's how we think about things. Unfortunately for the young Francis, his father died in 1749 when he was only 2 years old. But his mother was very fixed upon the idea that he would get a good education, and so he was very highly educated, and he was sent to Europe, where he studied and traveled extensively throughout the European continent, and became proficient in several different languages. And when he reached his majority in 1768-69, he inherited 60,000 pounds sterling, his part, which was a lot of money in that day and time. He was always very close with the Salvador family, and it was a kind of an extended family of merchants and traders, and shipping merchants. His uncle Joseph Salvador was an immensely successful businessman. He was the only Jewish director of the East India Company. And in 1755, his uncle Joseph bought 100,000 acres from John Hamilton. It was that same person who had been involved in the project to settle Jews in South Carolina. And the 100,000 acres was part of a 200,000 acre grant in Abbeville, Greenwood counties to a guy named William Livingstone. He sold Hamilton the whole 200,000 acres in 1753, and then Hamilton sold half of it to Joseph Salvador for 2,000 pounds sterling in 1755. So he's in London, but he's bought 100,000 acres of Carolina backcountry. Other Jewish people also bought lands from Salvador and Hamilton in that area. The Costa family, for one, bought a good bit of land in that area. And from what I have read, having not grown up there, that certain parts of that area up until the 1920s were referred to as Jews' land because so many Jewish people had had it early on. But at about this time, a series of financial disasters and reverses began to threaten the Salvador family fortune. November 1st, 1755, there was one of the most destructive earthquakes ever to hit Europe, struck Lisbon, Portugal. There were fires, there was a tsunami, the city was almost entirely wiped out. And even though the Salvadors had moved away from Portugal, they still did maintain many investments and properties there. So a lot of their properties were completely destroyed during that earthquake. And also, as that decade continued on, the 1750s and 60s, there were many wars between Spain and France and England, and much trading was affected. And because of that, the East India Company investments began to go down in value. And so the family really began to struggle and trying to look in new directions to try to recoup some of those losses. So in 1767, at age 20, the young Francis Salvador married his first cousin, Sarah Salvador, who was the daughter of his uncle Joseph, who had just bought 100,000 acres in South Carolina. And they still had a fair amount of money because she brought 13,000 pounds sterling as her dowry to the marriage. And he began to work in the shipping business of the family. They had 4 children together, 1 son and 3 daughters. Before Francis decided that things were beginning to get kind of dicey and that he needed to try to find a new way to make some money. And so he decided to rebuild that family fortune by going to Carolina and seeing what he could do on some of that land in 96th District. So in late 1773, leaving his family behind, he arrived in Charlestown. Shortly after that, he bought a little over 6,000 acres from his uncle/father-in-law, Joseph Salvador, and took up residence on that property with his uncle's business agent, Richard Andrews Rapley. Francis bought about 30 slaves and took them up to 96 to the land. And the plantation was on Carnaca Creek. Now, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that quite right. Anybody grew up down that way? Okay, all right. It was all, from what I see, it's often pronounced in that day Cornacre, and he referred to it as Cornaca or Cornacre. And he and Rapley shared a house together and began to grow indigo as their main crop, and of course growing corn as a subsistence crop and a supply crop. In September of 1774, he advertised for an overseer for the plantation, but he had to have indigo experience. And of course, making indigo was kind of an involved process. You couldn't just grow the stuff and it made the dye. You had to treat it, grow it a certain way, harvest it at a certain time, essentially let it rot in a wet vat for a certain time, add lime to it, and then dry it just so in order for it to be any good. But it was the kind of the second crop of South Carolina after rice at that time period. Now, his land was just to the north and east of the old town of 96. It's between there and the Saluda River. And what he intended was to get established and very quickly to bring his wife, Sarah, and the children to South Carolina. But the upheaval of the Revolution intervened before that could happen. Now, remember, he's getting here in the late part of 1773. And down in Charleston, they've had all kinds of political upheaval for years now by that time. Hadn't touched the backcountry too much at that point. But the royal governors and the Commons House of Assembly had been at loggerheads with each other for years, and the government had almost come to a halt at that point. But many arrivals who got to America at the very end of the colonial period, sided with the Crown when the war came. Thomas Brown, who y'all may have heard of as Burntfoot Brown, the Tory who was treated badly by the Whigs, I guess you would say. He had just got to Carolina in Georgia just a year or two before all of this. And most of them who just got here tended to be on the side of the Crown. But Francis Salvador was different, it would appear, because from the very first, he appears to have committed himself to the American revolutionaries, even though his family was all still in England, and there could have been some pretty severe repercussions from that. But he was a man of superior education. He had wealth, he had polish, and he had a good bit of experience for a young man of only 25 or 26 years old. He had been all over Europe. His neighbors, when he came to Carolina into 96, were primarily men who were fairly used to the frontier by that point. Everything was in flux. It was not a settled area at all. You had men like Andrew Williamson from, most of these guys were Scots or Scots-Irish. Andrew Williamson, Patrick Calhoun, Andrew Pickens, important men, but they were not, certainly did not have London educations and European educations. It was a very different type of person, but apparently he impressed his fellows pretty well and assumed a leadership role in the community right from the very beginning when he got there. The government in Charleston had gotten so bad and it didn't work that the Whigs, what we call the Patriots, set up their own governmental system called the Provincial Congress. Not the Continental Congress, but the South Carolina Provincial Congress. And the royal government, the Commons House, essentially quit meeting because most of the men were going to the Provincial Congress. It was to be made up of representatives from all over the colony, not just from the low country parishes, which was a big difference from the royal government, which was almost entirely low country dominated. December 19th, 1774, 10 men from 96 were selected as delegates to that Congress. And Richard Rapley and Francis Salvador, who had only been in the colony for about a year, were both chosen as delegates to go to Charleston and represent 96. According to the law of elections at that time, Salvador, who was a Jewish man, was not legally able either to vote or hold office in South Carolina, even though he could settle here. But apparently, the strictures of the law were not important to these guys. Of course, I guess they're making a revolution, so how important can that be? And so Salvador was elected. And the Congress, the first provincial Congress, met in Charlestown on January 11, 1775. And among its members was Francis Salvador. And he bears the distinction because of this as being probably the first Jewish man to hold elective office in British America. Other members who were serving at the same time were people like Colonel Charles Pinckney and Charles Coatsworth Pinckney, the Rutledge brothers, Henry Lawrence, Christopher Gadsden, Arthur Middleton. These are the big players in South Carolina's Revolution. Not only in South Carolina, but these are the guys who helped make the Continental Congress, who helped make the United States. And so he's rubbing elbows and working with some of the most important men in the American colonies. Salvador was appointed to many committees while he was serving in the Congress, one of which was the committee to enforce the Continental Association, which was an early attempt to make Britain feel the pain of what they were doing to America. They were agreeing to not export anything to Great Britain and not import anything from Great Britain. And so Salvador was on that committee in 96 to make sure that his neighbors behaved and didn't do those things. Of course, they probably didn't have a whole lot of opportunity to either import or export anything from 96 that didn't go through Charleston. But still, it was a mark of respect and confidence. Now, the first committee that he was appointed to, aside from this one, he was chosen along with Thomas Hayward, Charles Pinckney, Arthur Middleton, and William Henry Drayton, who was the Chief Justice of the colony and a firebrand revolutionary himself. The committee was to draw up a declaration of motives upon which the proceedings of the present Congress are to be grounded. So from the very beginning, he took a leadership role in that Congress. He was working with the big guys, and they were to develop the role the Congress was supposed to take. He was reelected to the Second Provincial Congress, and he returned to Charlestown for more meetings. As the backcountry heated up, he served on a committee to deal with the crisis of Cunningham having absconded with the powder and ammunition that was being taken to the Cherokee to keep them friendly. On February 7th, 1776, he was appointed to a committee to, quote, inquire into the state of the parts of the colony lately in commotion. So after the snow campaign and the quelling of the loyalists up here, he was definitely a part of that system who was trying to organize that and make sure that things did not get out of control again. He and John Lewis Gervais, or Gervais Street in Columbia, were tasked with abstracting letters that Moses Kirkland and John Stewart, the Royal Indian agent, had sent and had been intercepted by the revolutionary government. But probably his most important service during the Congress occurred when he and it always strikes at the wrong time. He and Charles Coatsworth Pinckney, just the two of them, were chosen to compare the new fancy engrossed copy of the 1776 Constitution of South Carolina with the rough draft that the Provincial Congress had approved. They found that they were the same, there had been no errors, and reported that fact to the Congress, which then adopted that Constitution on March 26, 1776. We still have that Constitution at the archives. It's one of the best looking ones we have. We've got what, 5 or 6 now, and that one's probably the prettiest one, probably in the best shape of all of them. Probably had the best paper of all of them, would be my guess. But it's kind of neat to me to know, having read this now, to go look at that and think. He and Charles Coatsworth Pinckney were both physically looking over that carefully to make sure it was right. Now that Constitution really gave birth to the state of South Carolina. And the Provincial Congress changed its name and became the General Assembly of South Carolina at that point. So membership was the same. There was no new elections. They just changed the name. It did not declare independence from England. And it claimed that the troubles and the Constitution was to be temporary until the problems with Great Britain could be resolved. But of course, that day never arrived. And so the Constitution became the basis of South Carolina's government, first independent government. Now, during the breaks of the Provincial Congress, Salvador went home to Carolina. He was farming, and he was preparing his neighbors for the revolutionary struggle, along with some of the other folks. August 31st, 1775, Reverend William Tennant, who was a Presbyterian minister from Charleston, was at Boonesboro, on Long Canes Creek, which is over in Abbeville or Greenwood now. He was there on a long tour of the upcountry to kind of whip up revolutionary fervor. And he got a really warm welcome amongst the Scots-Irish over there. They were, I guess, always ready to take up arms. After he gave his speech, Salvador gave a long speech haranguing and asking for independence, and he was apparently very effective. William Henry Drayton, the Chief Justice of the colony, was also traveling around the state doing the same thing. He was over in the area between the Broad and Saluda rivers, a little further over. And he did not get quite the same welcome that Tennant got, because he kept running into men like Robert Cunningham and Burntfoot Brown and Thomas Fletchall, who had very strong control of their militia over there. And most of those men, or a lot of those men, were more inclined towards the crown. And they raised 1,200 troops or so to march on 96. The Colonel Richard Richardson was dispatched with troops to meet them, and there was a bit of a standoff, but Drayton was able to play at politics a little bit and was able to get Thomas Fletchall to come to a parley. Now, Brown and Cunningham would not come because they didn't want to have anything to do with it. They knew what they wanted to do, and they wanted to stay out of Drayton's clutches. But Thomas Fletchall came and talked, and he ended up agreeing to the Treaty of 96, September 16, 1775, which bound the Tories not to raise arms in support of a British invasion, not to oppose the Provincial Congress, and in return it promised vaguely that they would not be bothered unless the Congress approved. And we know for sure that Francis Salvador was at this parley and was part of this treaty making because he signed the document as a witness along with several others. And we had that document in the archives collection. I didn't bring it, sorry. They wouldn't let me come out with it, but I did make a copy of it. And this is a copy of the Treaty of 96, and on the last page you can see Francis Salvador's signature. Left side. Shortly after that, Drayton had Brown and Cunningham arrested and sent them to Charleston, and things quietened down for a little while in the back country. They were the really capable Loyalist leaders. Fletcher, he was a little not so much, I guess you'd say. But all of that quiet came to a kind of an abrupt end about less than a year later. On June 27, 1776, Major Andrew Williamson, who y'all got several pictures of in the museum over there, was the commander of the 96th Militia. He wrote from his plantation called Whitehall, which was very close to Salvador's place. He wrote to William Henry Drayton, who was at Salvador's place, at Coronaca, and he was advising them that he had just had a parley with some Cherokees who had come down from the nation, and they had assured him that they would not interfere with the white people's dispute amongst themselves, and that if he wished to send men into the nation to round up bad white men, he could do so. They would not interfere. And he also said that he was sending Francis Salvador some gunpowder and bullets at the same time. And Drayton stayed with Salvador until Saturday, June 29th, when he picked up and moved on. On Monday, July 1st, 1776, the Cherokee and their white Loyalist allies swept down out of the Cherokee Nation upon the frontier, all up and down the frontier of South Carolina, Georgia, and North Carolina and Virginia. It was very coordinated. All along the line, there were isolated homesteads and farmsteads were just destroyed. The Hamptons, the Calhouns, and many, many, many others were attacked. Salvador's first hint was the arrival at his house of the son of Captain Aaron Smith. And the son had 2 fingers shot off, and he was telling of the massacre of his family. And Salvador jumped his horse and galloped over to Williamson's place. But he also discovered there that another one of the Smith boys had arrived and told Williamson already what had happened. Williamson sprang into action and began to try to gather his militiamen as fast as he could. But there began to be a problem, and at that point, Williamson was only ranked as a major. And there were higher-ranking men all over the backcountry, in particular lieutenant colonels and colonel everybody. There's lots of colonels. And a lot of them, particularly the guys over in the fork between the Saluda and the Broad, and were not willing to serve under Williamson without him having proper rank. So there was a bit of problem there. On July 15th, 2 weeks later, a group of Whig soldiers were moving toward a rendezvous with Williamson when they were attacked at Lindley's Fort, which is down in Lawrence County. But when reinforcements arrived, the Indians were driven off and some were captured. And it turns out that 10 of those who were captured were actually white Loyalists painted up like Indians. And so they sent them down to 96 to the jail to hold on to them for a while. And William Henry Drayton, who was the Attorney General of the state, later lamented that they had not been summarily disposed of. But Williamson continued to gather troops, and he began to move north into the Cherokee Nation. On the 18th of July, Salvador wrote to Drayton, who had moved back towards Charleston, from a camp at DeWitt's Corner, which I think is due west now, if I'm not mistaken. And he is advising Drayton that they are gathering more and more troops, more coming in all the time. He also reported that he thinks that Williamson is probably qualified to lead the expedition up into the Cherokee country, but his lack of rank has become a serious problem and needed to have something done about it. He also reported that Richard Parris and Robert Cunningham had come into the camp and volunteered to go fight against the Cherokee with the Whigs because of the attacks. But they advised them just to go peacefully home. apparently some of the men in the camp threatened to mutiny if they allowed them to come serve with those troops. On the 22nd of July, Williamson wrote to William Henry Drayton from a camp on Barker's Creek. They were just moving slowly up the country. Drayton had written to them to tell them about the victory at Fort Moultrie on the 28th of June, and so they were pleased about that. Williamson reported 700 effectives in his camp, and he was expecting more to arrive. And he told him that Salvador had been present with him since the army took the field, that he was serving as a volunteer aide-de-camp and was in camp all along. So I don't think Salvador was officially enrolled in a military unit, but he was part of the militia, and he was acting as an advisor and aide to Williamson. And Williamson outlined his plan. He was going to go by way of the Indian town of Seneca and then Sugartown into the nation. On the 24th, Drayton wrote to Salvador from Charleston, reiterating his belief that the Tories that had been captured and painted up at Lindley's Fort should have been instantly hanged for the public good, he said. So, he also reported to them that no news had been heard from Philadelphia, where the Continental Congress was meeting and discussing independence. And Drayton was a firebrand. He'd been for independence from before anything ever started. And he says to Salvador, quote, "Everyone is listening anxiously for that word independence. I say, Godspeed the passage of it. Amen, say you." So, and it is obvious that they had many conversations about this subject, and that he knew Salvador was a strong advocate of independence. Then Drayton gave his idea of what they should do in the Cherokee Nation, which he advised the army to cut up every Indian cornfield, burn every town, and that every Indian taken shall be a slave of the property of the taker, that the nation be extirpated, and the lands become the property of the public. For my part, I shall never give my voice for peace with the Cherokee upon any other terms than their removal beyond the mountains. In other words, total war, and that's what was being waged between the two sides in 1776 there on the frontier. And keep in mind, all this is going on in the space of about a month, what we're talking about here. On the 25th, Williamson was at Hencoop Creek, and on the 29th, he was at 320 Creek between Anderson and Pendleton. And there, he received news that Alexander Cameron, the deputy Indian agent, and many Indians and other loyalists were encamped on Oconee Creek, farther up into the nation. And that the town of Seneca, the Indian town of Seneca, had been deserted. So he resolved his plan to attack Cameron at the Oconee Creek location, which was about 30 miles away. So the night of the 31st of July, Williamson and his army started moving towards the village of Seneca Old Town, where the Seneca or the Esseneca, I'm not sure how you say it, not having grown up here, Esseneca Ford on the Seneca or Kiowa River, which apparently were kind of interchangeably used in that time. And this area, as best I can tell, y'all may know better, is that where this fort and this village were, is more or less on the Clemson campus or very shortly south of there, between there and the old the old stone church, kind of off old Cherry Road. And so if you can imagine where that is, you can imagine exactly where these things are going on. I think a lot of that may be covered by lake at this point. But what happened next is recorded in two accounts, one by Andrew Williamson and the other by William Thompson, of both in letters written on the 4th of August, after battle accounts, more or less. Let me pass this along while I'm You might find this a little hard to read. This is Andrew Williamson's letter to John Rutledge, who was the president of South Carolina at that time, reporting what had happened in the battle at Seneca. Okay. All right, Williamson says that to Rutledge that he set out about 6 p.m. on the 31st of July, hoping to catch Cameron and the Indians at Oconee Creek. He had about 330 horsemen, and he had 2 prisoners for guides who were going to guide him to where Cameron was, who he threatened with instant death if they proved deceitful. They didn't fool around. He said that he intended to ford Kiwi River at Seneca, although he was worried about the route because it was a major Indian town. All day long, they rode, or all night they rode along, and as they rode, they were ambushed by the Cherokee and by the Tories all of a sudden. And this is a quote, a direct quote. They had taken possession of the first houses in Seneca, meaning the Indians had, and posted themselves behind a long fence on an eminence close to the road where we were to march. To prevent being discovered, they had filled up the openings betwixt the rails with twigs of trees and corn blades. They allowed the guides and the advance guard to pass. When a gun from the house was discharged as a signal, and those behind the fence a few seconds afterwards poured in a heavy fire upon my men, which being unexpected staggered my advanced party. Here Mr. Salvador received 3 wounds and fell by my side. My horse was shot down under me, but I received no hurt. Lieutenant Farrar immediately supplied me with his horse. I desired him to take care of Mr. Salvador, but before they could find him in the dark, the enemy unfortunately got his scalp, which was the only one taken. Captain Smith, the son of the late Captain Aaron Smith, saw the Indian, but thought it was his servant taking care of his master, or could have prevented it. He died about half after 2 o'clock in the morning, 45 minutes after receiving the wounds, sensible to the last. When I came up, he asked whether I had beat the enemy, and I told him yes. He said he was glad of it, shook me by the hand, and bade me farewell, and said he would die in a few minutes. 2 men died in the morning, and 6 more were badly wounded. I sent down to the settlements. They were to be attended by Dr. Russell and Dr. John Delahow, who the John Delahow School was his home. Colonel William Thompson of Amelia in Orangeburg rode on that same day from the camp 2 miles below Kiwi. He says that about 1 o'clock in the morning, we entered the town of Seneca with which reports of 2 days before said was entirely evacuated. We had therefore not the least suspicion of meeting with any opposition there. The road went past the fence, and not being above 12 or 15 yards, to a steep descent which rendered it impossible for any but a few of our men to engage at a time. The guides and a few others advanced to the houses when they were fired 5 or 6 guns on us without any damage other than killing a horse. Then they began a heavy fire upon the advance guard in center, by which Salvador was shot through the body and left leg, and falling among the bushes, it being night and both parties mixed up, they got his scalp. Private Andrew Pickens, who was a cousin of General Andrew Pickens, was also in this battle, and he left an account years later. He said that the men were opening a gate in the fence at the opening or the beginning of the town of Seneca when the Indians opened fire. Said that Williamson was leading, dressed in plain clothes, but Salvador was dressed in white. And Pickens thought that it was obvious that the enemy took Salvador to be the commander and aimed for him. And the battle raged on for about 20 minutes, And the outcome was very doubtful at first. Colonel Leroy Hammond charged the enemy and drove them into the woods, which gave Williamson time to regroup his men. And then the other Andrew Piggins, the famous one, led a charge, brought his force up, and routed the Indians and drove them across the river and out of the town. The next day, the army destroyed Seneca, the town, entirely, burned to the ground, burned 6,000 bushels of corn. And that was the pattern that they took throughout the nation to make sure that the Cherokee would have to ask for peace. They would have no alternative. The dead, the American dead, the Whig dead, they buried in the hollow left by an uprooted tree on the battlefield. And presumably that's where Francis Salvador was buried. In some accounts, I've not seen any official or really well documented accounts say that many years later that Salvador's family had his remains taken up and shipped to England for burial. I don't know that for sure. I can't say. But and Williamson carried his campaign on into the Cherokee country and destroyed town after town after town. As the accounts of the war and the campaign made their way back down to Charleston, the loss of Francis Salvador was one of the main topics in these letters. And it was felt deeply, apparently. Henry Lawrence wrote to his son John Lawrence of events in South Carolina and included the accounts of the Battle of Seneca and said of Salvador that Mr. Salvador, a gentleman whose death is universally regretted, was killed by Williamson's side. Henry Lawrence is about as a powerful and well thought of individual that South Carolina has ever produced. And if he thought that of Salvador, he must have been a pretty nice guy. And what of Francis Salvador? We know that his wife and children probably never came to South Carolina. I used to say never a lot, but I learned a long time ago that you should hedge a little bit when you don't know for sure. They probably never came to South Carolina. We do know that his estate was probated, probably here, and perhaps in England as well. But I found no will and no packet of administration papers. In 1781, this is 5 years later, a bill of sale shows an administrator for his estate, John Lewis Gervais, selling a slave that belonged to his estate. Now, his uncle Joseph Salvador, his father-in-law, did move to South Carolina after the Revolution to try to recoup his fortunes, which had steadily gone downhill. He came to see what he could do with it. And he came to 96 and to Charleston. He died in 1786 and is buried in Charleston in a Jewish cemetery there. But his estate was tied up in litigation for many years as well. And the last case that we see involving Francis Salvador's estate is when his new administrator, Patrick Duncan, because Gervais had died, sued Joseph Salvador's estate, his father-in-law and his uncle, in 1799. So even 20 some odd years later, there's still litigation in these estates trying to get them settled out. And the case has to do with the lands in 96 and various sales and mortgages that had never been satisfied. But I think the reason that we cannot find Francis Salvador's estate records is in one of those earlier cases. It says that the case was the estate was administered in Orangeburg, and Orangeburg records had the misfortune of being visited by that person we shall not name in 1865, and so that probably is what happened to whatever existed of Francis Salvador's estate records. I'm not determined much about his family after that. I just have not found anything. I did see something that his son may have become an Episcopal or an Anglican priest. And so he at least may not have remained Jewish, but the others, I don't know. But in closing, the name Francis Salvador is known to South Carolinians for two things. First, Jew to be elected to and serve in a public body in British America. And he was the first Jew to lose his life fighting for his adopted country in the Revolution. He was born to a life of wealth and sophistication in London and in Europe. And he died a savage death on the frontier of a new continent. And he was here for less than 2 years. But his impact in that short time makes him one of this state's most important revolutionary heroes. Anyway, and that's what I have. See, and I'll be glad to try to answer any questions if there are any, but that may be just about all I know. Yes, sir.
In Lawrence County, there is a plaque to him on East 221, and there for Greenwood. You know the reason why he would have been in Lawrence County?
I'm sorry, say again?
There's a plaque to him in Lawrence County. And do you know of any reason why he would have been in Lawrence County?
Well, he may have purchased some lands over there, but he definitely was riding the backcountry in that time, along with William Henry Drayton and Williamson and some of those other guys. So he may very well have been going around. He was not settled over there. He was settled. His home was in what is now Greenwood County, I think. So not exactly. I don't know. Anybody else?
Well, I have something I'd like to tell you.
Okay.
Pass on to
All right, sir.
history like that. Our little city here, Simpsonville, has no less than 8 historic markers that we approved
Wow, that's a bunch. Yes, indeed.
in the state.
Very good. That is all.
Maybe small, but we're one of the most historic places. It's a small place.
When we were driving around, we were noticing historical markers all over the place. We certainly were.
What he won't tell you is that the person that's responsible for most of those historic markers is Al Futrell.
Okay.
He gives me too much credit.
No, no.
One of the things I want to thank you for personally, my wife, great-grandfather, was killed in a train wreck over in Belton County back in 1876.
Okay.
He was a Confederate soldier before that time, but nobody knew where he was buried after that train wreck. We knew where his wife was, but nobody knew where he was. And there was no record of it. My wife, per Tom's suggestion, wanted to get a military marker put up for him as a Confederate soldier.
Correct.
And so we had worked with the VA, and one of the things we ran into, we could not prove that he was dead.
Right.
We could not prove that this man was dead. I called the History and Archives research people, and a young lady helped me. I told her what the problem was. I said, we know he lived, he served in the Confederacy, and we know there was a train wreck, but we can't prove that he died. Well, it wasn't about 2 weeks later, I got an email from this young lady with a copy of the newspaper from 1876, that day, Anderson Independent, that told about the train wreck, listed the coroner's jury, and listed each one of their names and said they are here and they are dead. And that was fine. That was what we did.
Well, good. I'm glad that.
So,
I'm glad.
thank you.
Yes, sir. I'm glad that we were able to find something.
And I replied to the young lady in the research area.
Well, good.
And thank you for that.
Well, we were glad we were able to help because that's what we're there for. We tried from that's what we're.
I hadn't had a chance to thank him. I could have. Young lady, so thank you.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you very much. I did have one other thing. This one's not quite as interesting as the others, and I forgot about it. This is after the Revolution ended and the backcountry opened again for settlement, and the areas that had been Cherokee lands, the state began to give grants to individuals. This is a plat for a grant of land to a guy named, Robert Tate, for 504 acres on Kiowee River, or Seneca River, for including the old town of Seneca. And this is another one of the kinds of documents that we can sometimes find. It doesn't show anything exciting, but it is one of those things that, like, wow, that's pretty neat. Because it says in there, including the old town of Seneca. Unfortunately, there are no drawings on there of the old town of Seneca, but I guess it was pretty much burnt by then. But I thank y'all very much. I enjoyed coming, and
Thank you for what you did.
thank y'all. Thank y'all for what you do. And this is it's a very nice place, really very nice. Thank you.
If any of y'all have never been to the History Archives, do yourself a favor and go, okay? I love the money room.
Oh, yeah.
You read these old documents.